As we begin making our way towards the very end and the conclusion of Rousseau's Discourse on the origins of inequality among human beings, what we're going to be looking at straight in the face now is his notion of inequality in modern civilization. And he doesn't have a static viewpoint of it. He's going to tell us how it develops, but how it keeps on developing further and further and further, eventually reaching what we might call tipping points in which things begin to fail because of the level of inequality, and the whole process begins again. But it doesn't begin again from a neutral starting point like the state of nature that Rousseau had originally talked about. Instead, it's going to begin from what he calls a corrupted state of nature. But let's see how we actually get there. You notice I've got three main things here on the board and some arrows going from one to the next. So first we're going to look at inequalities as such, which exist not only in civilized society, but also in what Rousseau has been calling semi-civilized or barbaric or savage societies as well, where morality takes the place of law. Then we're going to look at the progress of inequality as he charts it developing in civilized societies. And then we're going to look at the consequences of the level of inequality that has developed within society. Because inequality and the lack of freedom that accompanies it, because of the culmination of inequality in this relationship of master and slave, power relations, relations of domination and exploitation, is going to affect the human person in such a way as to take us very far away from our original nature, according to Rousseau. So let's look first at the nature of inequalities as such. And he tells us that, this is towards the end, he says, if this were the place to go into details, I could readily explain how, even without the intervention of government, inequality of credit and authority became unavoidable among private persons as soon as their union into a single society made them compare themselves one with another and take into account the differences which they'd found from the continual intercourse every man had to have with his neighbors. So what we're talking about there is that earlier stage that we've looked at several times now in the other videos, where human beings associate with each other into what are going to become nations or tribes or peoples. They develop complex codes of morality, in part as an outgrowth of this comparison which they carry out with each other, and the need to not only feel self-esteem, but to be equally valued by society or by individuals that one comes across as one would feel about oneself. So Rousseau is saying even in that condition there isn't real equality, because people can compare themselves in a number of different ways. And he singles out four of them. One is wealth. So even before we have something like established property, guaranteed by laws, guaranteed by courts, guaranteed by entire systems to protect them, we have wealth. And wealth can consist in land, it can consist in cattle, it could be your equipment, your armament that you have, even the produce of your tools. So the smith who creates tools, his tools that he's selling to other people in order to get food or to get clothing or to get shelter, that's his wealth. So that's one thing in which we can be very unequal. And, in every society, once people have actually started to live together, some people are going to come up to the top and some are going to go to the bottom. We've seen that Rousseau explains this in terms of inequalities in the trading process. There's other differences as well that matter, though. Rank or nobility. In what we could call tribal societies, not everybody is on the same level as far as honor or rank. Some people are considered to be better than others, and they're not better in the sense of being wealthy. They may actually be poorer than others, but they are elevated. They have access to things that other people don't. Perhaps they have ceremonial roles. And of course, rank and nobility and wealth could go hand in hand. They could correspond to each other. but there can be a disjunction between them. And we see, for example, in ancient Greece, a disjunction as we move from the Bronze Age into, later historical times, that one of the big preoccupations is, hey, what about these new kids on the block who are, lording it over everybody because they're wealthy? They don't actually have nobility, but they're trying to buy it. And we see this happen in lots of societies. Power is another differential as well. Power means the capacity to get other people or to compel other people to do what it is that you want to do. And in some societies, the nobles may actually hold the power, or the wealthy may hold the power, but it could be that power is held by people who don't have nobility, that somehow they arrive at the ability to control other people, for one reason or another. Oftentimes we see in societies where we would assume that the person who is at the top of the hierarchy as far as rank or nobility is in charge of everything, that maybe they're just a figurehead, that the real power lies elsewhere. And then, now notice what Rousseau does here. Personal merit. Personal merit is something that's different from wealth, from rank or nobility, from power. It may be the thing that provides them. He actually says personal merit is at the origin of these. So if you actually have personal merit, you'll be better in generating wealth if your personal merit happens to be being thrifty or being a hard worker or something like that. Or, maybe your personal merit lies in protecting the community, and so they give you honor because of that. They give you a rank. Or perhaps it leads to people putting you in charge of things. They give you authority because you're competent, you're wise when it comes to that. You have practical wisdom. But personal merit is something quite different, and we are confronted quite often in our relationships, in our organizations, in our workplaces, as teachers and students, with the disjunction between all these sorts of things. Consider, for example, grading. Who gets good grades? If the class is set up the way it's supposed to be set up, it's those who actually earn the good grades by doing the work and mastering the material and displaying their understanding. What if I were to give out grades on the basis of wealth? In a certain way, that does kind of happen in some schools, doesn't it? There are some schools where kids who, whose parents have a lot of money go to, and they'll tell you, look, I earned my A by coming here. Why don't you just give it to me? Same thing can happen with nobility. Same thing can happen with power. These can interfere with things. And Rousseau is going to talk about these as being able to come into harmony or come into conflict. He says, the harmony or conflict of these different forces is the surest indication of the good or bad constitution of the state. Here he's actually echoing something that Aristotle himself is going to say in his Politics, where Aristotle will talk about wealth, and he'll also talk about freedom, or being part of the many. And the wealthy and the free, the few and the many, tend to square off against each other. One are oligarchs, the other are Democrats, and they both make claims to who ought to be in charge, who ought to have power, and who ought to be accorded honors. And both of them, Aristotle says, make bad claims, because the one thinks that because they're equal in some respects, they're equal in all respects. The other think because they're unequal in certain respects, they should be unequal in all respects. And Aristotle says, you know who they've left out? They left out the good, the aristoi, the ones that we get aristocracy from, the ones who actually have some personal merit or virtue. And they have the greatest claim to rule, but exercise it oftentimes the least, because they're less willing to engage in the kind of party politics that goes on. So Rousseau is echoing something here that previous theorists have said as well, which is that a society functions well when all of these can be acknowledged and they can be harmonized with each other. It functions poorly when one of these predominates and becomes the measure for all of them. And he says that the greatest danger, of course, is that it's going to happen with wealth. Why wealth? Well, he says, riches tend most immediately to the prosperity of individuals. It's really easy to relate to wealth, and are easiest to communicate. Why are they easiest to communicate? Because you can reach into your pocket and get out some money and give it to somebody. You can write a check Whereas, providing them with rank or power or personal merit, that takes a lot more time. He says they are also used to purchase every other distinction. Those who have wealth can kind of subvert the system in certain ways, you might say. So he's saying that this happens in all societies. We have some relative inequalities going on, whether we expect them to or not. So we can't get away from inequality absolutely. The question is whether the inequalities that are actually occurring are going to be what we might call iniquitous inequalities, or unfair inequalities, or disharmonizing inequalities. Now let's move to the progress of inequality. We've seen that at one point Rousseau is saying that the institution of laws and property come in. Why? Because the rich are dominating the society and the poor end up becoming their slaves, or they end up becoming criminals, and the rich say, well, this is pretty good for us so far. We do dominate the society, but we're not at the point where our property is actually secure. And as Rousseau is going to say a little bit later, rich people feel they feel their emotions, they feel their passions running throughout all of their property. So you make fun of their clothing, they actually feel that. Even though it's not really a part of them, they identify it as part of them. Their land, their possessions, all of those sorts of things, even the prerogatives and privileges that come with it. So there's this institution of laws and property. And what that does is that consolidates. It doesn't wipe away, but it consolidates the distinction between rich and poor. And why does it do so? Because laws keep us from taking each other's property. That's why the rich want to have laws in the first place, not to protect persons. They can hire other people to do that. They already have, some capacity for that. They want to protect their property. And the poor don't have property, so it's not particularly helpful to them. We move then to magistracy, and we'll talk about what Rousseau means by this term and how we end up there. But that's the second stage in this. And what he means by magistracy is what we might these days call government. Government with a capital G, meaning everything from legislators, politicians, through executive agencies, through everybody down to the proverbial local dog catcher and postal employee. Everybody who works for the bureaucracy that governs our lives, that structures our reality. And there we're dealing with a different distinction. A distinction between the strong versus the weak. Those who have power versus those who don't have power. Or even those who have access to power, those who have relative power in relation to those who lack power, and those who power is exercised upon, those who have to listen to other people telling them what to do, those who have to live in accordance with the will of other people. The third stage, we move from a legitimate magistracy in which there's power being exercised, but it's actually for the benefit of everybody, or at least most people, to arbitrary power. We move away from legitimate to arbitrary government. And here the relationship becomes one of master versus slave. Whether we have an institution of actual slavery or not, Rousseau is saying that in this sort of case, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about economics, whether we're talking about other kinds of distinction, some people have absolute power over other people. It's gone beyond just the strong versus the weak. It's gone beyond the rich versus the poor, and now it's master versus slave. It's a case of complete unfreedom on the part of certain people, including not just the slaves, but also the entire hierarchy of masters who have to be in there. So what are the consequences? What is the state that we actually live in modern civilized society? It's pretty bleak the way that Rousseau sketches it. He says that the progress of civilization has brought a few good things in its wake and a whole bunch of bad things. So on the whole, it's been a decline, not a progress. It's been a corruption rather than a process of flourishing and becoming better and better and better. He talks about modern man as living in an environment in which this is the case. We're obsessed with frivolous and deceitful appearances. Instead of being concerned with the realities of things, we're concerned with how things appear, how they appear to other people. We care too much about what other people think or about what our public image is. If I want to go a little bit further with this, we purchase commodities that are designed to give us, a boost of feeling good about ourselves, but won't really satisfy us. We buy into entire networks of people who exercise power over us by doing so. If Rousseau were here and he was looking at social media, I think he would have a lot to say about that in this respect as well. Then he talks about honor without virtue. And again, we come back to this distinction of rank. People are ranked even though they may lack personal merit. Sometimes even because they lack personal merit, people are held up in esteem. Think about the cult of celebrity that we have that's fostered not only by Hollywood and by all of these, magazines and websites and the celebrities themselves, but even by the ordinary consumer who is talking about this rather than talking about things that really matter. Honor without virtue, great example right there. Reason without wisdom. We're able to be reasonable, we're able to pursue our interests, we're able to think about things, we're able to provide accounts, but we're not able to do so in a way that really reflects wisdom, knowing what's truly best for us, knowing what's truly best for our neighbors, for our community. This is a big charge that he's leveling there. Pleasure without happiness. This is probably the most touching part of it. Is it possible to have pleasure without happiness? Hedonists, those who believe that pleasure simply is happiness, would say no. But there's something about a hedonistic lifestyle, Rousseau would say, that's not only empty, that's not only false, that's not only deceptive, but actually buys into this entire power complex that's set up to turn us into parts of the social organism and parts that are on the weak side. Pursuing pleasure just for its own sake or in order to try to make oneself feel good when one feels bad will not actually bring us to happiness, according to Rousseau. This is a really interesting speculation to think about. He actually has a great discussion here as well about, he uses the example of a minister of state. He says, civilized man is always moving, sweating, toiling, racking his brains to find still more laborious occupations. He goes on in drudgery to his last moment, and even seeks death to put himself in a position to live or renounce his life in order to acquire immortality. And, if you're thinking about people who are caught in the position of wage slaves, who are caught in debt, who are just working and working and working, always having to hustle, always having to try to do something more, only to see everything slowly, ebb away, all the opportunities disappear over time. This is the sort of thing that he's talking about. He says he pays court to men in power who he hates, and to the wealthy who he despises. He stops at nothing to have the honor of serving them. He's not ashamed to value himself on his own meanness and their protection. Proud of his slavery, he speaks with disdain of those who have not the honor of sharing it. Those who are able to get into the organization, those who are able to be in the in-group, even though they're treated badly as a result, take that as, I'm at least better off than those people over there. And how often do we see this attitude in the society that we live in today? People can be quite unhappy with their circumstances, but if they find somebody else who they can have some power over or look at and point out and laugh at, then they feel a little bit better, Rousseau says. And that's probably as true in our own time as it was in his. So we have this interesting development going on. Now what I want to talk about is one particular stage in that development, the move to what Rousseau is calling magistracy. And he references one of his other works, at that time, if I remember right, a work in progress, the social contract at that time. And the idea is that society and law and property is coming out of a social contract, an agreement within society. What a social contract means, and Rousseau is not the only person to use this term. As a matter of fact, he's not the first person, and his version of the social contract is actually at odds with many of the other social contract thinkers. Rousseau thinks that there's a basic agreement within society, something that he calls the general will. And we could call this, in our day, a mandate. So if we ever do get our act together on something like, say, Social Security reform, in a fundamental way, and not just patching things up, but trying to think about how are we actually going to provide for people in our society in a fair way that reflects their contributions and also provides a social, safety net for people, that could be an expression of the general will. If we get to the point where liberals and conservatives can actually, get their collective heads out of the sand about global climate change and what it would take to actually do something about it, and I think both sides are equally at fault with that. The one for denying things, the other for politicizing everything possible with it and using it as a stick. If they can actually get together on the same page and say, holy tamale, we've got a problem here that we have got to solve, and there arises a sort of resolution about it that includes most of society, that would be an expression of the general will. So there are some basic things where we can get together and we can say, let's do this. Let's actually respect law and property and have a society that works. If crime rates spiked through the roof, I think that we could probably get both liberals and conservatives together on the same page saying, well, we got to do something about this. That would be an expression of the general will. Now, as Rousseau points out, it's not enough just to have laws. It's not enough just to have a general idea about what we ought to do. He says that bodies politic in a state of nature among themselves, they end up, or not among themselves, bodies politic don't actually know from the beginning, through experience, just how screwed up things can get. So what has to be the case? Eventually, they come to realize that somebody has to be given authority. So out of the general will, or out of the social contract, is going to come some sort of, we can call it, executive power. Or authority. Rousseau is going to use the word magistracy because this was a word that was used by many people at that time. So he says, want of experience and philosophy prevented men from seeing any but present inconveniences. And so they build on that, and the network of laws is not the best one. You need somebody who's actually going to administer the laws. Another thing that we would call this is government. And now we have an inequality being introduced of power, right? There's a power differential between those who actually exercise this authority on behalf of the general will for all the people involved in the society and the rest of the people who have to obey it. This makes other people subject. So Rousseau is going to talk at different places about a difference between being a citizen, being part of the people who form the general will, and being a subject, being somebody who has to obey the authorities. So what's going to happen? He's actually going to discuss a lot of ways in which people might come about, how did authorities begin. I'm actually going to skip over quite a lot of that. I don't want to get bogged down too much in those details. He says that government did not begin with arbitrary power. This is the deprivation, the extreme term of government, and brings it back to just the law of the strongest. That's where we're going to end up talking about in a moment. In the beginning, he thinks, those who are selected for these roles don't actually abuse their authority. They're not selected just on the basis of wealth, they're selected on the basis of being the best people for the job. Now, that doesn't last, and that is going to lead to new problems. So long as the executive power is doing what it ought to do, it's actually fulfilling the general will of the people. The people are actually better off in that case. But once it starts to behave in an arbitrary, that is, not ruled by the general will, arbitrary manner, it's going to focus more on benefiting itself, on benefiting those who are actually fortunate enough to be placed into positions of power. Rousseau is going to talk about the difference of governments in terms of the degree of inequality that they have. So he says, when they're choosing their government, they can choose a monarchy, sorry. Mixing up my Greek terminology there. If they choose one person, then they're choosing a monarch. If they're choosing a number of different people who are more or less on the same level, they're choosing an aristocracy. And if they're choosing to more or less function according to the will of the people, we've got a democracy in place. But even democracies require some sort of rulers, some sort of people who are actually answering to the will of the people, who are doing this as a full-time position. So he says, if we follow the progress of inequality in these different revolutions, we're going to find that establishment of laws here is going to lead to magistracy, and that's going to lead to the conversion of legitimate into arbitrary power. Now, how does that happen? He charts it out for us. He says, with time, people begin to get in conflict over here. If we have a monarch, then presumably the monarch can actually, run the show. But you actually have dynastic problems with monarchs as well. They often don't want to let go of power. We're going to see how that leads to families in a moment. If you have aristocracy, they may not all be on the same page. Or if you have a democracy, think, for example, what happens in our current democratic governments, where we might have parliament or we might have a senate, and we elect a whole bunch of people, and then they argue with each other. They're not able to get on the same page about what the general will is, and they try to seize power from each other. Well, what does that lead to? He says, ambitious chiefs profited by these circumstances of chaos to perpetuate their offices in their own families. That's one side of the coin. So we end up with what we call dynasties. A dynasty is a government in which people of the same family rule. Aristotle actually called this dunasteia. He considered it a special kind of oligarchy. At the same time, why is this able to happen? He says, well, the people themselves go along with it. The people already used to dependence, to not exercising power. Ease and the conveniences of life agreed to an increase of its slavery in order to secure its tranquility. So they're saying, look, we'll allow you to have more and more power, and not only to have power, but to have other things as well, just so long as we can have an easy, comfortable life. So what happens then? It says political distinctions. We have political inequalities produce civil distinctions. The growing equality between the chiefs and the people is soon felt by individuals and modified in 1,000 ways. The magistrate could not usurp any illegitimate power without giving distinction to the creatures with whom he must share it. So now we have a whole bunch of strata beneath the government who participate in the power of the government. They have their position, they have their status based on their engagement with the ruling party, the ruling power. And they're okay with that, even though they're not in charge, because there's always somebody below them. There's always somebody further down in the hierarchy. And what does this introduce? This introduces the passion to be on top, but not necessarily to be all the way on top, just to be relatively higher, relatively better off than some other poor sucker beneath you. So he says, individuals only allow themselves to be oppressed so far as they are hurried on by blind ambition, looking rather below than above them. They come to love authority more than independence, and they submit to slavery so that they may in turn enslave others. And here it's worth pausing for a moment. I remember when I was in basic training in the Army when I was a young man, so we're talking about, decades ago. Being in basic training, there were people who were, we were all treated pretty badly by the drill sergeants, but that's what drill sergeants do. And the whole point to it is they're trying to break you down so that they can sort of remold you into a soldier. And I remember there being people who would say things like, man, when I'm a sergeant, I am going to be the biggest jerk ever. I'm going to make these guys look like nothing. And then there were some other people who were like, man, when I make rank, I'm never going to be such a jerk as these other people. Now, what's going on there? The one bunch of people recognize this is not a good way to treat people. It may actually be necessary for the Army, so maybe they aren't going to be good sergeants. They're not going to be good non-commissioned officers. But these people over here, they're doing exactly what Rousseau is talking about. They're saying, so long as I get to mistreat somebody, so long as I get to lord it over somebody, it's going to be A-okay for me. I'm even willing to wait for a while and put up with the nonsense that these people are making me go through, because pretty soon my time is going to come, and then I'm going to get to stick it to somebody else. I won't be the one who's getting stuck to. I'll be the one who's holding some degree of power and making somebody else's life miserable. And this is what Rousseau thinks happens in civilized society because of the workings of inequality. It's not just that inequality by itself produces this, it's also the constant need to compare ourselves with others. So, going on a little bit further, he says, there's this universal desire for reputation, honors, and advancement. It inflames us all. It exercises and holds up to comparison our faculties and powers. It excites and multiplies our passions. It creates universal competition and rivalry, or rather enmity, that is hatred, among human beings. Occasions numberless failures, successes, and disturbances of all kinds by making so many aspirants run the same course. He says, I could show that it is to this desire of being talked about, this unremitting rage of distinguishing ourselves, that we owe the best and the worst things we possess, both our virtues and our vices, many bad things, a few good ones. And what's he saying there? The worst thing about modern civilized society is not that there exist these great degrees of inequality, but that we buy into them, that we accept them so long as we can use them to try to compare ourselves against others in a favorable way and dominate them. And if you've ever heard of what's called a zero-sum game, Rousseau is talking precisely about that. A zero-sum game is where if somebody benefits, somebody else has to suffer. There's only so much to begin with, and whoever gets the most wins. And if you take more and more, that means that other people have to have less and less. And that's the way these sorts of goods and distinctions go. So what does this lead us to? Here we wind up at a kind of end point. Rousseau is going to say that when things get bad enough, we wind up in a new state of nature. And why? Well, because it's just a matter of the strong versus the weak. Those who are able to exercise power dominate. Those who don't. So he says, the last term of inequality, the extreme point that closes the circle and meets that from which we set out, is this disorder that comes about. Because there's so much inequality that the system crashes. All private persons return to their first equality because they are nothing. Subjects having no law but the will of their master, and their master no restraint but his passions. All notions of good and all principles of equity again vanish. There is a complete return to the law of the strongest. And we've already seen this. This is where we were before we got to law and property and what we can call civil society or civilization. So what Rousseau is saying is this will lead to a collapse, and for a while those who are the strongest will just exercise power, and then people will get sick of that. The stronger will actually get sick of it, saying, hey, I'm not really secure, and the weak will get sick of it, saying, this is a terrible situation, and they'll get together and they'll form a new social contract. But is it going to be better? Is it going to be progress? In Rousseau's view, it's not going to be. Because it's just going to set up the same dynamic. Unless we actually do become wise, unless we actually do become the virtuous that we present ourselves or would like to think ourselves as being, but actually aren't, we're just going to have the same dynamic of this generating magistracy, political institutions, which then will be used by the ruling class. We'll have a whole new set of hierarchy and ordering going on with people, being okay with their position so long as they can look down on somebody else and so long as maybe they can even rise a bit. And the entire situation is going to perpetuate itself. So there really is no way out of the inequality of modern society in any permanent way for Rousseau.